The mug hit the hardwood and burst into 3 clean pieces, and Roland Hollis didn't so much as glance down at it. He tossed the manila envelope onto the kitchen island, the way a man throws down a losing hand of cards, and he said, in a voice he'd clearly practiced in the car, or the shower, or wherever it was he rehearsed his cruelties, "Sign them. I want you out by the end of the month." It was 6:40 in the morning. Outside their condo on the 22nd floor, the fog was still sitting low over the harbor, and somewhere below, on Queens Quay, a streetcar dinged its bell twice and rolled on. Adaline Voss stood at the counter, in the gray cardigan she'd owned for 9 years, holding a coffee she no longer wanted, and she looked at the envelope the way you'd look at a strange dog that had wandered into your home. He wasn't finished. Men like Roland were never finished. The wound had to be complete, or it didn't count. He reached past her to the little corkboard by the fridge, where she kept her sketches, the rough ones, the ones that were only for her, and he pulled down drawing of a courtyard she'd been designing in her head for 3 years. He tore it in half without looking at it. "This," he said, "this is what you chose over me little pictures? You're 41 years old, drawing little pictures while I built something real." She said nothing. That was the thing he would replay later, in the months that came after, and it would drive him half out of his mind. That she hadn't cried, hadn't shouted, hadn't begged. She had simply set her coffee down on the counter with a care that was almost tender, and she had looked at him with an expression he couldn't name, and what he couldn't have known, what nobody in that condo could have known, was that in a little under 5 hours, Adaline Voss was going to sit at a walnut table on the 51st floor of a tower on Bay Street and put her signature on a deal worth $780 million. If you've ever been made small by someone who was supposed to love you, if you've ever swallowed a thing so many times you forgot it had a taste, then stay a while, because this story is going to go somewhere, and it's going to be worth the trip. Wherever you're watching from tonight, whether it's Toronto or Halifax or a kitchen in Thunder Bay, with the kettle on, leave the name of your city in the comments. And if you believe that the quiet ones are the ones you should never underestimate, go ahead and subscribe. Now let's begin. To understand why Adaline didn't flinch that morning, you have to understand what she'd been doing at 4:15 every day for the better part of 6 years in the second bedroom that Roland called the junk room and never once entered. She woke before the alarm. She always had since she was a girl in a bungalow in Scarborough, where the only quiet in a house of 5 people came in the hour before her father left for his shift at the plant. She'd learned early that the dark belonged to whoever was brave enough to be awake in it, and she had never given that hour back. Roland slept like a stone until 7, and by the time he was fumbling for his phone, she'd already been at the drafting table for the better part of 3 hours, coffee cold at her elbow, the city below her, still deciding whether it wanted to wake up. Nobody knew. That was, if she was honest with herself, and there in the aftermath she was, finally, brutally honest. Part of the problem. Roland thought she was a mid-level architect at a firm that would never make her partner. He thought she designed lobbies and parking structures. He said it at dinner parties with a little laugh. "Addie does buildings, boring stuff. Don't get her started." And she'd let him. She had let him think small of her for years, and later she would sit with the question of why a woman would do that, why an intelligent woman would let a man's contempt calcify around her, like frost on a window, and she would not give herself an easy answer. The truth had layers. The first layer was that when she'd tried, in the early years, to tell him what she was really building, he'd looked at her, the way you look at a child explaining a dream, fondly, and then passed her at the television, so she stopped telling him. The second layer was uglier, and she owned it. She had come to prefer his low opinion, because it meant he asked nothing of her, and asking nothing of her meant she was free. A husband who believed her ordinary was a husband who left her alone at 4:15. She had traded intimacy for solitude, and told herself it was a fair trade, and it had taken the tearing of a drawing to show her the price. And there was a third layer, the deepest one, the one she hadn't said aloud to another living soul. In 30 years, her name was Rosemary. She'd been Adaline's little sister, younger by 6 years. And when Rosemary was 8. She'd been diagnosed with a degenerative neuromuscular condition that the doctors in 1994 could barely pronounce and certainly couldn't treat. What Adaline remembered was not the diagnosis. What she remembered was the driving. The endless driving, her parents in the front seat, Rosemary in the back, with her head against the window, the two of them making the 4-hour trip to the only pediatric rehabilitation center in the province that would take her, over and over, in every season, on the 401 in whiteout snow, because there was nowhere closer, because the system had not been built with a girl like Rosemary in mind. She remembered the waiting rooms with their orange plastic chairs and their fluorescent hum. She remembered her sister trying to do her exercises on a mat in a hallway because there wasn't a proper room. She remembered most of all the way her mother's face closed a little more each year. Rosemary died at 19. She never got the center she deserved. And somewhere in the grief, 17-year-old Adaline had made a promise, so private and so enormous that she'd never dared speak it, only build toward it, brick by brick, year by year, in a junk room her husband refused to enter. So that was what Adaline Voss did, at 4:15 in the morning. She had spent 6 years assembling it in the dark, not a building, a network. A public-private partnership to design and co-develop a chain of pediatric rehabilitation centers across Ontario. Purpose-built, humane, close to the families who needed them, so that no 8-year-old would ever again do her stretches on a mat in a hallway 4 hours from home. She had drawn every one of them. She had also quietly, with a patience that would have astonished the people who thought her ordinary, learned the parts of the work that architects usually leave to other people. She learned financing. She learned procurement. She learned how a woman with a vision and no money turns that vision into equity instead of a paycheck. She founded a firm nobody had heard of, registered under her maiden name. And she structured the whole enormous thing so that she did not merely design it. She owned a piece of it. For most of those 6 years, it was a fantasy she nursed before dawn. And then, 11 months before Roland threw the coffee mug, it stopped being a fantasy, because a woman named Vivienne Laurent read a proposal that had been passed hand to hand up the chain of a development consortium until it reached the top. And Vivienne Laurent, who was 63 and did not waste her time, picked up the phone. Vivienne was the sort of person the city produced, maybe, once a generation. Montreal raised, Toronto forged, a builder of hospitals and transit lines and a fortune to match, with a directness that people mistook for coldness until they needed her in their corner. She had lost a grandson to a long illness. She did not talk about it. But she had read Adaline's proposal twice, and the second time she'd read it, she'd put it down and looked out at the lake for a long while, and then she'd said to her assistant, "Find this person, and don't let her know how much I want it." They had met in a cafe on Ossington, deliberately unremarkable, and Vivienne had watched this quiet architect explain her work with a fire that never once raised its voice. And she had thought, here is someone who has been waiting her entire life to be asked one serious question. So Vivienne asked it, "How much of yourself are you willing to put into this?" And Adaline had said without drama, "All of it, I already have. Nobody's just noticed yet." The deal took 11 months to build. Adaline built it at 4:15 in the morning, and she told no one. And Roland went right on believing his wife designed parking structures. Which brings us back to the morning of the mug. He wanted a reaction. When he didn't get one, he escalated the way small men do, reaching for the thing he thought would land hardest. "There's someone else," he said. "Has been for a while. Her name's Bianca. She has a life, Adaline. She goes places. She's not up at 4 in the morning like some kind of ghost." Adaline picked up the two halves of her torn drawing from the floor. She fit them together in her hands, the courtyard she'd been designing, the little bench she'd put in the corner, where a tired parent might sit in the sun. She looked at it for a moment. Then she set the pieces on the counter, gently, side by side, and she said the only thing she said to him that entire morning. "You should have asked me what I was drawing." Then she went into the junk room he had never entered, and she closed the door, and she got dressed for the most important day of her life. The car Vivienne sent came at 11. It was a black sedan, and the driver was a soft-spoken young man named Callum, who called her Mems. Voss and held the door, and as they pulled onto the gardener with the lake flat and silver on the left, Adaline let herself feel for exactly the length of that drive, the full weight of the morning. She was not made of stone. That was another thing people got wrong about her. She simply understood that grief, like everything else, could be scheduled, and that a boardroom was not the place for it. So she gave herself the drive. She let her eyes sting. She thought about Rosemary's head against the car window on the 401, and she thought about her own head against this car window on the gardener, 26 years later, going to build the thing that would have saved her sister. And she let the two of them ride together for a few kilometers. By the time the sedan pulled up on Bay Street, she had folded the grief away and become the other woman, the one nobody at home had ever met. The boardroom on the 51st floor was the kind of quiet that costs money. Not empty but hushed, controlled, 14 people arranged around a walnut table, with a view that made the harbor look like a toy. Vivienne Laurent sat at the head of it in a charcoal suit, and when Adaline walked in, she stood. Which made everyone else stand, and that told Adaline everything she needed to know about her own position in the room. A lawyer named Desmond Clark walked her through the pages. Her partner, Priya Anand, the one person she'd trusted with the secret, a young engineer she'd poached from a firm that didn't deserve her, sat 2 seats down with tears she was pretending were allergies. There were speeches, the way there always are. A man from the province talked about generational infrastructure. A woman from the bank talked about de-risking the model. Adaline listened to all of it with her hands folded, and she thought about how strange it was that a room full of powerful people describing her life's work in the language of finance could not touch the actual thing, could not even see it. The little girl on the mat in the hallway, who was the reason any of them were here. When it was her turn to sign, Vivienne slid the pen across the table herself. It was a nice pen. Adaline noticed absurdly that her hand was steady. She signed her full name, the whole thing, the way you sign something that will outlast you, and when she set the pen down the room, did a thing that boardrooms don't usually do. It applauded. Not politely, genuinely. 14 powerful people who had, an hour earlier, mostly thought of her as a technical detail, on their feet because somewhere in the last hour they had understood what they were looking at. Vivienne didn't applaud. Vivienne caught her eye across the table and gave her a single nod, small and complete, and Adaline understood that from a woman like that, the nod was the applause. Her phone had been buzzing in her bag through the whole meeting. She checked it in the elevator on the way down, alone in the mirrored box with her own reflection, and she saw the news alert that had gone out at 12:04, the one Roland would have seen too if he ever read anything but the sports scores. A national business outlet. Her firm's name, her name, the number. 780 million, the largest pediatric infrastructure partnership in the country's history. Led by a Toronto architect who, the article said, had operated almost entirely outside public view for the better part of a decade. She stood in the elevator and read it twice. Then she put the phone away and did not smile, because the person she wanted to show it to had been dead for 26 years. Now here is where a lesser story would give you the part you're waiting for, the part where Roland gets what's coming to him, loud and immediate, and you'll get it, but not the way you think, and not yet, because the truth of these things is that revenge is rarely a scene. It's usually a slow weather change, and it happened to Roland Hollis the way frostbite happens, from the edges in before he understood he was cold. It started small. His mother phoned him. Margaret Hollis was a woman who had spent 6 years treating her daughter-in-law like hired help who'd overstayed, correcting Adaline's grammar at Sunday dinners, asking pointedly when the real career was coming, sending Roland texts about how he could have married up. Margaret called her son at 12:30 that afternoon, and her voice was strange, and she said, "Roland, is this Adaline? This woman in the paper. Is this our Adaline?" And Roland, who had signed divorce papers that very morning and left them on the counter, felt something drop in his stomach that he would spend a long time refusing to name. He drove to the condo. She was gone, of course. She'd taken a suitcase and a hard drive and nothing else, and she'd left the torn drawing on the counter, the two halves fitted carefully together. He stood in the junk room he had never once entered, and for the first time in 6 years, he actually looked at it. The walls were covered, floor to ceiling, elevations and site plans and watercolor studies of courtyards with benches in the corners where a tired parent might sit in the sun. There was a corkboard, and pinned to the center of it was a photograph, old and a little faded, of 2 girls on a porch in Scarborough, the taller one holding the smaller one who was in a wheelchair, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. On the back in a teenager's handwriting someone had written, "For Rosie, I'll build it, I promise." Roland Hollis sat down on the floor of the junk room and he stayed there a long time. Bianca left him within the month, for reasons that had nothing to do with Adaline, and everything to do with the fact that Roland was not, it turned out, a man who went places, so much as a man who'd needed someone to make him feel large. And once the largest thing in his life had turned out to be the wife he'd thrown away, he had a great deal less to offer. His firm, a mid-tier investment shop, had been quietly courting a contract with a provincial infrastructure fund. That fund, as it happened, was now deeply entangled with the Laurent Consortium. Nobody ever said Adaline's name in a meeting. Nobody had to. Contracts have a way of not materializing. Calls have a way of not being returned, and a man can spend a year telling himself it's the market when really it is the simple gravitational fact that he chose the wrong person to underestimate. He was not ruined. This is not a story about ruin. He was, precisely, made small, reduced to the actual size he'd always been, without a quiet, brilliant woman standing behind him making him look larger, and that, for a man like Roland, was worse than ruin. But Adaline was not thinking about Roland. That's the part that people who've been wronged find hardest to believe, and it's the truest part of all. The best revenge isn't something you do, it's something you become. And once you've become it, the person who wronged you shrinks to a footnote you rarely reach the bottom of the page to read. She was thinking about the work. There was so much of it. A deal is not a building. A deal is a permission to begin, and the beginning was enormous. Sites had to be secured in Sudbury and London and Ottawa, and a first flagship center right in Toronto, on a plot of harborfront land that Vivian had been quietly holding for a decade, waiting for the right reason to use it. Adaline moved into a small apartment in the annex with good north light and a drafting table by the window. And she went to work in the daylight now, out loud, for the first time in her life, and she found that she'd forgotten what it was like to be believed. Priya became her second in command, and slowly her friend, which was a thing Adaline had not had much time for, and hadn't realized she'd been starving for. Vivian became something harder to name. Not a mother, Adaline had one of those, and not a mentor exactly, because they were peers now in a way that had surprised them both. Something more like a fellow traveler who happened to be 22 years ahead on the road. They had dinner once a month at a little Portuguese place on College where nobody bothered them. And Vivienne, who never gave compliments, said one night, apropos of nothing, "You know why it works, what you're building? It's because you're not doing it to prove anyone wrong. Half the people at that table thought you were. I could see it on them. But you weren't. You were doing it for the girl on the porch." And Adaline had not told her about the porch. She never found out how Vivienne knew. The flagship center took 2 years to build. Adaline was there for all of it, in a hard hat in the January wind off the lake in the mud of the spring, where she'd drawn steel a decade earlier, in a junk room, in the dark. She had put the courtyard in, the one from the torn drawing, the bench in the corner, angled to catch the afternoon sun. She had fought the value engineers to keep it, because it wasn't strictly necessary, and she had won, because it was her name on the whole thing, and she had learned, finally, at 43, to spend her power on the things that mattered. The center opened on a Saturday in late October. There was a ribbon, and there were speeches. The province again, the bank again, the language of de-risking and generational infrastructure, and Adaline stood through all of it in a good coat with her hands folded, the way she'd stood through it on the 51st floor. And she thought again about how the words never reached the thing, and then the words ran out, the way they always do, and the ordinary afternoon reasserted itself, coats gathered, coffee poured, the crowd thinning into the light. And it was in that ordinary hour, when nobody was performing anymore, that a woman approached her, holding the hand of a girl of about 9. The mother's name was Farah, and she couldn't quite get the words out at first. Her daughter had been on a waiting list for 2 years for the kind of therapy this center provided. 2 years of a 4-hour drive, each way, to the only place that would take her. 2 years of a girl doing her exercises in a hallway. The mother said all of this in fragments, and Adaline stood very still and listened, and something opened in her chest that she had kept clamped shut for 26 years because she knew that hallway. She had sat in it. She had watched her sister on the mat in it. The girl, her name was Nora, did not say much. She was shy, and she was tired, and she had a folded piece of paper in her free hand that she'd clearly been carrying for a while. Because the edges had gone soft, her mother nudged her gently. Go on. You made it for her. Nora held it up. Adaline crouched down to the girl's height. There, on the polished floor of the courtyard, she'd drawn, 10 years before, in the dark, and she unfolded it. It was a drawing, a child's drawing in marker, on the slightly waxy paper that comes in school sketchbooks. It showed a building, this building, roughly, with its wide windows, and out front 2 stick figures. One small with a triangle for a dress, and one tall, and above the tall one the child had drawn, in careful yellow marker, a large lopsided sun. Or maybe a star. At the bottom, in the uneven letters of someone, still learning them, it said, For the lady who built the place where I can walk. Adaline Voss, who had not cried, on the morning her husband handed her divorce papers, who had folded her grief into the length of a drive down the Gardner and put it away, who had signed her name to $780 million without so much as a tremor in her hand. Adaline knelt on the floor of her own courtyard in front of a 9-year-old girl and could not for a moment speak. She held the drawing very carefully. The way you hold something you already know you'll keep forever, she said. Nora, this is the best thing anyone has ever given me. Do you know that? And the girl, uncertain, nodded, and then smiled. And the smile undid something in Adaline that 6 years of 4:15 mornings had built up like a wall. She thought about the photograph on the corkboard. For Rosie, I'll build it. I promise. She thought about the 2 girls on the porch, one holding the other. She thought about all the things a person builds inside the silence, while the people who claim to love them are somewhat looking else entirely, at the television, at the sports scores, at a life that goes places. She thought that Rosemary would have been 45 now, and that she would have liked the bench in the corner, and that she would have laughed at how long it had taken her big sister to keep a promise. Tell me, Adaline said to Nora. Is the courtyard good? Is the bench in a good spot? I need an expert opinion. And Nora gravely considered it and said the sun hit it nice. And Adaline said that was exactly what she'd been going for, and it was the truest conversation she'd had in years. She kept the drawing. She had it framed, and she hung it in her office in the flagship center on the wall directly across from her drafting table, where she'd see it every time she looked up from her work. Not next to the awards, there were awards now, and she was cordial to them and forgot them promptly. She hung it next to the old faded photograph of 2 girls on a porch in Scarborough so that Rosemary and Nora could keep each other company, the girl who never got the center and the girl who did. People asked her, in the interviews that came now, whether she felt vindicated. They wanted her to talk about Roland. The story had gotten out, the way these stories do. The husband who'd thrown away the woman hours before the deal of the decade, and it made a good headline, and she understood why they reached for it. But she never gave them what they wanted, because the headline, though it wasn't false, wasn't the truth either. The truth was quieter and harder and more worth saying. She had wanted her whole life to do one thing that mattered, one thing that would reach back through time and put its hands under the weight her family had carried alone on the 401 in the snow. She had been told in 1,000 small ways by 1,000 people who thought her ordinary that she didn't have what it took. She had believed them some days. She had let a man tear her drawings and call her nothing, and she had let it happen for longer than she'd ever fully forgive herself for, and she had learned too late to be proud of, but not too late to matter, that the low opinions of small people are not a verdict. They're just weather. You wait them out. She did not hate Roland. This surprised her most of all, in the years that followed. She had expected to, felt she was owed it, the way you're owed a wince after a burn. But hatred required that he still occupy space in her, and he simply didn't anymore. He had been a man who needed her small so that he could feel large, and the day she stopped being small, he had lost the only thing he was really holding on to. She hoped, in a distant, unbothered way, that he'd figure out how to be his own size someday. She did not stay awake wondering whether he would. On the first anniversary of the center's opening, she stood in the courtyard in the late afternoon, alone for a moment, before the small ceremony they'd planned. The bench in the corner had the sun on it, just as Nora had certified. A father sat there with a toddler asleep against his chest, catching a few minutes of the light while his older child was in a session. He didn't know who Adaline was. That was, she thought, exactly right. He would never know that a girl named Rosemary had ridden with her head against a car window for 4 hours to a hallway with orange plastic chairs, and that her sister had spent 26 years in a marriage, and every dawn she owned, making sure this tired man could sit in the sun for 10 minutes while his kid got the care they both needed, close to home. He would just sit there. That was the whole point. The best things you build are the ones nobody thinks to thank you for, because they've stopped seeming like a miracle and started seeming like the way things simply are. The lake was going gray and gold behind the building. Somewhere out on the water, a ferry sounded its horn, low and long, the way they do at the end of an ordinary Toronto day, asking nothing of anyone. Adaline Voss watched the man and his sleeping child on the bench she'd fought to keep, and she took out her phone, and she did the thing she'd been doing every year on this day. She scrolled to a photo she'd taken of Nora's drawing, and she looked at the careful yellow sun, and she said, quietly, to no one and to 2 people, "There. I told you I would." Then she put the phone away and she buttoned her coat against the wind coming off the water, and she went back inside, because it was almost time, and there was, as there always was, so much more still to build.